Okay, everybody, and welcome to today's CX Midday Spark for Tuesday, November 10th. Can you believe it? And we are actually part of the group of folks that are responsible for helping you to ignite a CX celebration and carry it throughout the entire year. Because Customer Service Week isn't just a week, it's really a way of doing things ongoing. And for me, I have one of our senior contributors to Customer Service Weekly, Jeannie Walters. Thanks, Jeannie, for joining us.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks, Jim.
Well, I can tell you, we've had a great discussion, more than one, about this particular topic. But it's for us, it's focusing in on, how do we take customer experience as a concept and as a strategy and put in the tactics that we're wanting in order to get the outcome that we desire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I think that there is so much to talk about with this topic. We can really start talking about how do we define success? How do we make sure that we have a clear vision of what success looks like for customer experience? So that's something I'm talking to a lot of people about right now.
Well, you're going to have to define that for us. So what exactly are you meaning with that, right?
Sure. Well, customer experience is one of those topics that sounds really cool and people think they understand it, and they are often asked to do something about it. They're told things like, okay, guess what, Jim, you're now in charge of the customer experience. Godspeed, right? And they get very little instruction. They get very little expectation setting, all of these things. And so when we hear about all these grim predictions about customer experience professionals losing their job, I think a lot of that is because we haven't taken the time to define what success looks like in our organizations. What is the strategy that we're going to apply to meet those outcomes? And then you talk about the tactics you need in order to get to that strategy level. I think sometimes we jump in, people get very excited about things like customer journey mapping, and they think this is going to help us. This is great. But we need to do a better job of defining what success looks like in customer experience.
Okay, I think you bring up a really important point here, because customer experience and people who become responsible or accountable for that come from a lot of different areas. So
Absolutely.
I see from a contact center world, a lot of people start to now have the title of customer experience. They're looking at it across all of their digital channels. They're looking at it across all the different departments. They're looking at it from all of their different processes, procedures, because they have a wealth of insight and information in the contact center. Well, that's one way. Another way is you have people who are in, analytics and measurement teams and who are measuring the experience. And you have a lot of different ways that people kind of make it into being responsible for the customer experience. But here's what we do know is that all of them need to work together.
Yep. They all need to work together. And I would go one step further based on what you just said and say sometimes they're pulled in from marketing, or they're pulled in from, I've seen HR and learning, I've seen digital, all these different places. And if we are not really defining what that success and strategy looks like, then it's really hard to build those relationships, to build that coalition with fellow leaders and say, I need you to care about this with me, because they don't really see why they should. If we're talking about things like Net Promoter Score, or we're talking about just the contact center, then it's really easy for leaders that we need to be invested in the entire end-to-end journey, for them to kind of shut down and think, well, that's your job. I don't have anything to do with that. Or NPS, great. Yeah, it's good to have that go up, but it doesn't really affect our business. We need to translate all of these things that we talk about into real business outcomes and terms.
Okay, as you're saying that, I start thinking about talking about the journey of doing CX, right? And you have to really chunk a lot of this down, because there's also, we're not even getting into the different types of deployments that people have in their organizations in regards to customer experience. Sometimes it goes across, departments. Sometimes it's its own department. Sometimes it's directly into the C level. Sometimes it's, somewhere in process and quality. I mean, that's just a whole different dynamic that it's going to take a heck of a lot more than 15 minutes for us to get into. But I think ultimately what you're talking about here is, thinking about the tactics, because this is important, the tactics that are necessary in order to be able to start the process. So can you help us a little bit in that area?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I do is we talk about what is the success statement? Like, what will it look like in a year if we are successful? Because it's really easy to paint things in these really broad terms, like we're going to be best in class, or we're going to provide superior customer experience and service. But if we don't take the care to really define that in organizational outcomes, in what's important to our leadership, in what's important to our customers. I mean, we created a whole workbook. It's actually free on our site. Anybody who wants it can get it, experienceinvestigators.com, to help leaders really think through these things because it is so important and it's a step that we have skipped. And I think that when we skip that step, we are then setting ourselves up to kind of be chasing our tail all the time with these tactics. Like journey mapping can be incredibly effective, but you need to know where you're going. You need to know what the purpose is. It's really important to understand your contact center metrics and understand how those things, when they move around, can impact the business. But if you're only chasing those metrics, then and you're not tying it back to the business outcomes, then how do you know if you're successful? That's really what I believe is a big obstacle in what we're doing today. We need to define success better.
And that hits home for me in a lot of ways. So I worked with a colleague and we created the speech analytics masterclass because speech analytics, talking about VOC, customer experience, can have a massive impact for an organization. And she took Carmeet DeAndrea, who helped me develop that program, and she took a position with a company and polled the executives on what they knew about speech analytics and how it could potentially impact their organization. And she took that information and therefore started creating a learning module and process to help make sure that everybody was on the same page so that they could get full value from their speech analytics program. And we need to do the same thing for CX.
We do. I think part of this too is that we need to stop talking about it as this bolt-on thing. I talk about it as a mindset strategy and a business discipline. And I can't imagine a world where one quarter sales dip a little bit and then the CEO says, well, I guess sales don't work, right? Like let's get rid of the whole program. Nobody would say that because it's just an accepted part of business. Customer experience has to be seen the same way. We have to really represent it in that way where it's a continuous business discipline. It's not a program. It's not something you bolt on and say, now we're customer centric because we're tracking NPS. That's not how this works. We have to really get a little deeper here and think about it in bigger terms.
Well, okay. And what you even said right there, we often hear about the employee experience and how vital that is. However, I think what we're talking about here makes the whole go back to strategy of employee engagement in regards to CX to have many different viewpoints and perspectives. This goes beyond just that person who's delivering and connecting and interacting with the customer. We're talking about employee experience, employee engagement that's much more complex, yet is very much something that needs to be part of our planning process and can be.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that, you look at the best brands in the world and many of the disruptors of the last decade or so, they started with experience. So they understood how important this was. They started with understanding that they had to keep getting feedback from customers and translating that into not just how are we going to introduce a new product, but how are we going to help our employees understand their role in this as well. I mean, when we talk about one of my favorite examples with this is HR, we often don't let them be part of these conversations, and yet they're hiring the very people that we need to deliver these programs. Isn't it vital that we have customer experience in those job postings, in how we hire people, in how we evaluate people? That's all part of this. So I think that if we look at it as more of that overarching strategy, then we can start figuring out, and your example is great, where we can figure out what do we need to do inside the organization to make sure that we're delivering this customer experience. So the learning program that you talked about, or I worked with a CX leader who actually ran her own internal NPS program with other leaders to figure out how much are they buying into this CX thing. And then she could work on that so she could track it. So there are so many ways to do this, but it really starts with understanding what is our strategy and what does success look like.
Well, and as you were saying that, it kind of like where we started, going back to full circle, is that it's going to be hard to find as many people that are as passionate about you about this.
Yep.
So
Yep.
you have to figure out some way in order to be able to leverage that in a way that is going to make ultimately the impact that we were talking about. Because if you just try to meet them at the level of passion, you may be a little bit disappointed.
That's a fair point.
Okay, so when we start looking at this, you had mentioned a very important word that I think for all of us, and matter of fact, even before we started recording, I think we were kind of talking about this too, and that is innovation. For me, I've been on this innovation, talking about another passion, creative thinking and innovation for a while now. On the Fast Leader Show, I have tons of people on my podcast that were talking about innovation in a multitude of different ways and how to be more innovative. But I think the other thing that you had talked about is new organizations understand the experience and they start from there. Well, we're not always gifted to have that new organizational experience and outlook. And we may be in a legacy organization that has to now transform, get rid of old habits. So how can we be more innovative if we're in those situations?
This is a great question, and it's a real challenge. I mean, there are organizations that have legacy systems that are really hard to change and transform. And I think, first of all, it has to come from the top. We have to really hear leaders talking about how important it is to innovate around the customer experience specifically, not around all the products all the time. If you're a product-driven organization, it's really hard to then start talking about customer experience innovation and have people on board. So it really has to come from the heart and soul of the leaders there, but then anybody in their organization can start these conversations, can be that change agent from the inside, can really start talking about, is this the right thing to do for our customers? We keep hearing, in software, for example, they have these sprints and different things like that. And sometimes you'll hear the same thing over and over and over in customer feedback. And you go and talk to the product people and they say, well, it's not in our roadmap. And it's like end of discussion. And if you have a culture like that, it's really hard to, do things differently. But one of the things I say when I'm speaking is if you hear the phrase, it's the way it's always been done, just flip the table over. Like that is totally an unacceptable answer in anything we do. And so I think that's part of it too, is flipping the script and saying, if we didn't have to do that, how could we do it better? And just, encourage people to think that way. But it really does. Leadership has to voice this a lot. They have to really communicate that this is critical and that we are focused on innovation. Otherwise, it's really easy for people to just keep doing what they've always done.
Most definitely. Jeannie Walters, thank you very much for sharing your insights and knowledge on this Midday CX Spark. If you could, please tell all these CX Igniters out here how they can get in touch with you.
Sure. Yeah. Our site is experienceinvestigators.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I have a couple courses at LinkedIn Learning, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram and all those places. So happy to hear from you.
Jeannie Walters, thank you very much, and you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.